The chandelier hung like an accusation over the long glass table, each crystal catching the light and throwing it back with a kind of cold, confident brilliance. Laptops blinked, coffee cups steamed. Power in the room had its own rhythm, measured, rehearsed, unhurried. Alexandra Ashcroft was 2 minutes into a quarter-end address when sound shredded that rhythm, a soft, ridiculous sound that bloomed into a thud. He went down like something finally giving up. The room rounded the sound like a tide. Folded notes fluttered. A tablet skittered across leather. For a moment, everyone simply watched the body on the floor, as if watching a stain spread on silk, as if the urgency belonged to someone else. Then someone stood, and someone else screamed, and the glass held its own echoes. Bernard left the mop propped by the hallway tile. It was the smallest possible rebellion, a rubber strip sliding, water sloshing the wrong way as he ran. He worked nights, did the math everyone else pretended not to notice. Hours, tips, a steady stream of anonymity. But in that second he did what he had learned to do in the 2 or 3 other panicked places he'd been. He moved toward the person who needed him. He did not think of protocol. He thought of breathing. He thought of the hollow cavity of a chest, the way air leaves you like a folded letter. He thought of his daughter, of small hands clutched around bedtime stories, of the iron taste of fear. He thought of nothing at all and let his hands remember. Suits recoiled as Bernard pushed through, mop handle thumping behind him like a small, honest heartbeat. The carpet swallowed some of the sound. Alexandra's face was a pale map. Bernard dropped to his knees. The world narrowed to where his fingers touched soft skin, to the ragged line of a neck. He tilted the head. He breathed. He pushed down. He pushed up. Count, feel, compress, release, compress. He fought in those minutes as if those compressions were the last measure he had of control. "Hold on," he said, not to an audience, but to a pulse he could not yet find. His voice was small in the high room. Someone pressed a phone into his hand to call 911. Someone else filmed with the phone, unconcerned whether it was for evidence or spectacle. The seconds that should have stretched into an hour were thin as paper. Paramedics arrived with that particular efficiency of people who practice panic on purpose. The EMTs took over with gloves and a different vocabulary: defibrillator, airway, shock. Bernard sat back on his heels as if someone had lifted a weight off his shoulders, and immediately hands in tailored sleeves grasped at him. "Sir, you can't be in here, security," said a voice like a judge. He had done the necessary thing. He had not asked for permission. That, in the room, looked like transgression to half the people standing. To others, it looked like theater, a cleaning man trying a role he did not belong to, a dramatization for likes.
Bernard could feel the texture of those judgments settle on him like dust. They found a reason to remove him. A woman with press credentials called it uncomfortable proximity. A legal counsel framed it as breach of conduct. Security escorted him out with a kind of embarrassed delicacy, their gestures saying without words that they were things you did not do, especially when the optics were fragile and the cameras were rolling. Outside the glass doors, the mop bucket waited, abandoned. Bernard pulled the strap of his janitor's jacket closer. His palms still tingled from the effort. He smelled antiseptic and coffee and fear. A folder had been left on the corner of the mahogany table, a file marked Q4, Ashcroft Initiative. He had seen it in the shuffle of bodies, thumbed its edge with the tip of his finger, and then focused himself back on breathing. He could not have guessed that a frame from the security camera, the part where his hands were on her chest, where his shoes were so close to a dress shoe, would be taken out of context and turned into a weapon. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. The line comes out of nowhere now, small and practical, and then life presses in again. They walked him to a small security office and handed him a letter. It used the language that ends things, but sounds like business: inappropriate conduct, violation of workplace guidelines, immediate termination. The printed signature felt colder than any spoken accusation. Bernard read it with the same calm you give a bill you cannot pay. The clerk slid a storage bag across the counter for his personal items: a keychain, a battered paperback, his daughter's crayon drawing folded into a pocket like contraband. They took his badge. They did not ask how many years he had served. They did not ask which nights he had worked double because her daycare closed late. They did not ask about the spare pair of shoes he kept for puddles. In the hours that followed, something else moved faster than officialdom: rumor. A clip cropped and recropped. The angle shifted until the sequence read like intent rather than accident.
An influencer with an appetite for outrage posted a freeze frame captioned with a question that didn't care for answers. What was he doing? Comments came in like rain, some defensive, some cruel, some casting aspersions with a kind of naked glee. Screenshots found chat rooms. Chat rooms were stolen into trending threads. The camera image was all the proof some people needed. No one wanted the messy, complicating truths. Bernard walked home with the weight of the letter in his palm, as if the paper itself could bruise him. He had learned to hold sorrow like this, small, private. The building hummed with the same indifferent neon. Molly waited for him at the hallway table, her homework stacked like a confession. "You okay?" she asked, voice too small for the apartment.
He knelt and checked the calendar she kept, colorful stickers standing in for days that had gone well. He did not tell her about the room full of suits, or the way his throat tightened when he had to stop compressing to let the EMTs work. He did not tell her about the post he had seen, the one suggesting he'd harmed rather than helped. Instead, he rinsed the mop in the sink and let the water go down the drain, as if it could take the moment with it.
A hashtag formed. The office grapevine, long used to stretching small slights into epics, served trope after trope until the narrative became a thing people preferred because it was clean and easy. There was no nuance in the feeds. Nuance takes time, and time is not content. Tyler Brigham watched the surge with a professional's distance. He sat in his glassed-in office that hung above the lobby like a citadel and watched the numbers climb on a media dashboard. Mentions, sentiment, reach. Tyler had become the guardian of predictable outcomes. He knew that when optics threatened a brand, you had to move fast. Statements, sanitized apologies, legal framing. He did not want the board to become a headline. He did not want months of investors calling and demanding answers. He believed that narratives were mercifully simple when the right people tightened them. He authorized a brief, crafted to sound impersonal. Briefs are the lawyer's poetry. "We are cooperating with authorities," it said. "We have zero tolerance for behavior that compromises the safety and dignity of our colleagues." The words had no warmth. They were designed to stop leaks. Tyler wondered, privately, if the company would be accused of insufficient care if it let the video remain unaddressed. He preferred control to the wildness of waiting. Bernard's phone was a quiet witness. The voice messages that afternoon were fewer than the usual. An aunt checking in, a few co-workers from nights who left fast, disbelieving comments. A number he did not recognize called and left a clipped message that made the word scandal sound like a clinical condition. He listened and then pressed his thumb against the glass until the screen went dark. He did not like to share fear in front of Molly. He wanted the house to remain a small island of ordinary things. He wanted, always, to protect the world he had made from the things that could break it. Still, the world intruded. He missed shifts because he could not bear to stand under the fluorescent lights of the public stairwell where whispers had become a chorus. Molly's teacher called, a voice that had steadied her through scraped knees and homework meltdowns. Her name, he remembered, was Evelyn Hart. Mrs. Hart had been the kind of teacher who kept extra pencils and a smile that lasted past school dismissal. She had taught him, when he was a teenager, that words could open doors that muscle could not. She had told him once, in a way that made him laugh at himself afterwards, that he had the kind of face that read like a reliable book. "Everything okay?" she asked over the phone, the question carrying the weight of a woman who had watched a child become a man. He said he was tired, which was neither a lie nor the whole truth. She said she would pop by after school, which she did, offering a casserole and a quiet chair and an ear.
When people come with casseroles, they are telling you that time matters more than money, and in a rare way, it is more valuable because it cannot be posted online. At night, the posts did not sleep. They multiplied. The angle that had been posted implied that Bernard had overstepped. It made him a figure in a meme. It made people brand him as transgressive rather than brave. He watched the comments stack up like sediment and felt his name disintegrate into a rumor. He could have tried to defend himself outright. The thought of legal letters and depositions exhausted him. He had learned an economy of indignation, a tight budgeting of the outrage he could afford. Alexandra watched the footage her security team had sent her on a loop, alone in the quiet of a private office, with a coffee gone cold beside a glass of water. She was a person used to commands that landed like artillery. She had been taught the arithmetic of decisions and consequences. The image that burned to the center of her chest was not the version the world had made viral. It was not the cropped stills, not the outraged pundit captions. It was a frame the security camera captured where his face was a small, concentrated line of focus, where the angles showed his hands moving with intention, where her eyes were half closed and seemed to blame themselves for every other step they had taken that morning. She asked for the raw footage. She watched it twice and then a third time. It was one of those rare moments when the polished shield of power slides and leaves you with a naked truth that is inconvenient. Some of the people immediately around her called it panic management. Others called it moral clarity. Alexandra found herself unusually feeling haunted. You could tell yourself that you had hired the right people until the one moment that proved, in a way that no spreadsheet could, that human life was not a line item. She could have left a matter to HR, to legal, to PR. She did not. Instead, she asked a question that would infuriate committees. Who is he? Not who is the janitor in this clip, but who is the man whose hands kept working even when the room had turned away? She wanted names, an address, a truth. The request was small and irresponsible and perfectly human. The people in her orbit thought her sudden interest was because of reputation. She allowed them their guess. The truth, separate from corporate contingencies, was simply that something in the footage had not matched the story she had been told by the headlines around the office. That night, as Bernard sat on the edge of a couch and Molly slept with her cheek against his forearm, the city felt both close and barbarous. An eviction letter leaned against the shoe rack like a waiting friend. He had nowhere to go but the tiny apartment he had chosen and the life he had built for a child who deserved a sense of normalcy.
He checked locks he used to check without thinking, listening for steps on the stairs as if every passerby might be carrying a camera. A neighbor muttered about canceled subscriptions and contempt for those who drew attention. The building's management sent a terse notice asking him to be mindful. Small humiliations are cumulative. They are not dramatic the way a headline is dramatic. They are slow and relentless, the water on the stone. It wore at him. It wore at Molly, who learned, under the weight of adult worry, to ask the kind of questions that make grown men quiet. Alexandra traced the security badge number through internal records until she hit a last entry that had been put in her company's system years ago, a janitor who had been with the building through a dozen tenant turnovers. The record showed nothing exotic. It showed a man who had simply kept places clean. She asked a question of a receptionist who remembered him by his joke about too much coffee. She was not expecting answers that complicated her tidy world. She found him where people like to vanish, in the hospital waiting room across town, which smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee machine oil. He had called earlier that morning because his chest had been tight and his breathing uneven. He had thought it was the aftershock of the day, the exhaustion that settles in after a body has done something traumatic. He had not expected an ambulance. He had expected rest. But the chest tightened further and then unraveled, and somebody dialed for help. By the time Alexandra arrived, the clinical hum of the emergency department had replaced the manic energy of social feeds with its own quieter pressure. She stood near the reception, a figure from the other side of the glass. She saw him slumped in a chair, pale as the hospital gown he'd been given because there had been no spare jacket. He looked, in that moment, exposed in a way power rarely allows you to be. The sight of him, the same hands that had pressed into her chest, now folded against cold fabric, removed any filters her advisors might have offered. No one informed the news cycle yet. No one had made a sticky headline to wrap around this new, soft fact. Here, in the hospital's fluorescent integrity, there was only the close, unstoppable fact of a man who had given everything he had that day and was possibly paying a price for it. A nurse moved with precise, practiced economy. She checked vitals and asked standard questions that felt like a formal litany for returning to the world. Bernard blinked with the slow recalibration people carry back from an edge. His voice came out thick, as if words had to pass through gauze. I think I just did what needed doing. Alexandra did not say she was sorry in the way certain personas apologize with a press release. She said it quietly and plainly. Thank you, she said, and there lay the strange sliver of culpability. Gratitude and guilt threaded together.
He looked at her, and for a second, they were both unattributed to the narratives that had gathered around them like moths. He was given fluids, a battery of checks, the benign theater of emergency medicine that keeps people tethered to ordinary life long enough to build a new narrative. The doctor explained monitors and mild stress reactions and the need to rest. None of it erased the smear, or the firing, or the 1,000 small forces that had pushed him into that chair. None of it made social media stop. but it bought him a kind of silence, a moment where the world could not speak for him. It was then that Mrs. Evelyn Hart arrived, a casserole tin in hand, and worry thinned into something sharp. The news had spread through the school and through friendships that move on a different timetable than feeds. She had been the one who always stayed when a parent needed a word. She had been the one to know the cadence of a boy who thought he carried his armor too carefully. She stood in the doorway for a beat, took in the small hospital room with the pragmatic appraisal of a woman who knew the difference between sympathy and the sturdier thing, truth. She had not come to be a spectacle. She had come to be a witness. When she saw him, really saw him, as a person rather than a frame, something flickered across her face. It was not a performance. It was recognition, followed by a kind of astonishment that had less to do with the hospital gown and more to do with a folded object protruding from his jacket pocket. She crossed the room with a normality that belonged more to teachers than to CEOs. She sat down and took his hand in a way that implied history. Her eyes were dry and grave, and then, like a shutter, they caught on the edge of a paper tucked there. She reached and let the paper slip free into the open light. It was nothing like the black rectangles on screens. It had the smell of old offices and ink, a registered stamp pressed into a corner that bore the family name. The paper held a quiet that did not belong to the life the world had assigned him in 20-second loops. Mrs. Hart's hand trembled the smallest amount, enough for Bernard to notice despite the room's dull white noise. "Bernard," she said, and her voice refracted into several things at once. Disbelief, a private hurt, the sudden knowledge that one of her students, long ago, a boy with an uncertain future and better jokes than grades, had kept a secret that reframed everything people had assumed about him. He followed her gaze, and his eyes widened as if seeing the paper was like seeing a distant shoreline he had once known. He had hidden that certificate not because he thought the world would be kinder if it found out, but because he wanted to avoid spectacles that turned people into props. He wanted to keep a life that would not feed headlines. He wanted to parent without the friction of charity or the drama of a public savior. Mrs. Hart's breath came out very slowly.
The mixture of shock and something else, a quiet, pained admiration, settled over the room like a new weather. Outside, the city did not yet know. Inside, people who had been on opposite sides of a viral moment sat with the human fact of a man whose hands had saved a life and whose pockets hid a truth that made a different kind of complicity possible. Her reaction was not the end of anything. It was a hinge. The look on her face said what the feeds could not, that the act itself, the choice to step forward, to risk being judged, was what mattered, and that hidden fortune complicated but did not negate the courage. It also said, in a way she may not have intended, that secrets have weight, and secrets can fracture trust as quickly as accusations. Bernard felt it in the bone of him, the worth of what he had done, and the sudden prospect of having that worth read differently because of a single paper. The room contracted and then expanded. Outside, through the thin curtain, a television in the emergency waiting area looped the cropped stills. The world continued to spray its simplified versions of events, while in this small shared air, more complex truths rearranged themselves. Mrs. Hart folded the certificate and held it like a relic, not for show, but because it demanded to be considered. She looked at Alexandra, who stood by the doorway, and felt the old teacher's responsibility coil into action. This was not a 10-second clip, she seemed to say without speaking. This was a life, and lives, once seen, do not shrink back into neat headlines so easily. That look passed between them, and the room tightened with decisions that had no easy answers. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, Tyler Brigham was already drafting the next press release. Somewhere online, a forum debated the ethics of contact. Somewhere else, a mother brewed coffee and texted a friend, "Did you see? He saved her." Bernard closed his eyes for a second and thought of Molly sleeping at home, of the refrigerator collage full of adhesive stickers, and the scrap that said, "We don't need more things." He felt exhausted, but oddly resolved. The presence of the certificate, out in the open now, made things more complicated. It made people ask, what does it mean when someone chooses to hide their resources? Is anonymity a virtue or a dodge? Does money make an act more or less noble, or does it merely change who keeps the score? Mrs. Hart's fingers brushed his arm as if testing for warmth. Her face was still that mixture he could not read into small phrases. The shock of a teacher witnessing a life she had helped shape into an unexpected truth. The kind of moral calibration that is less about applause and more about tending. Her reaction had weight because she carried authority in the community, not because she held power in a corporate sense.
The way she looked at him suggested that she could turn a story, not with the glossy polish of PR, but with something harder,
a willingness to tell what she knew to be true in front of other people. The question, what will she do with that knowledge, hung in the air like a cord unresolved. Outside, the city's light leaned against the hospital windows, and the screens in the waiting room kept looping a frame that did not show the beginning or the end. Inside, where people breathed with each other's proximity, the edges of a different narrative began to form, one that would require courage from more than a janitor, one that would ask a CEO to look beyond optics, and one that would demand that whole institutions reckon with the ways they ignore people until they become inconvenient. It was not a resolution. It was the first small hinge toward one. The hinge held for a moment and then began to turn. Outside the hospital, Tyler Bringham's dashboard pinged with the tidy architecture of outrage. Inside, the room where Bernard lay convalescing felt like a different economy, one measured in small kindnesses and questions that didn't have to be answered for an audience. Mrs. Hart sat on a vinyl chair that had seen 30 years of parent meetings and after-school conferences. She folded the certificate again and laid it on the bedside table as if putting down a book whose last chapter she had only just understood. "I taught him to read for the punctuation between sentences," she said to Alexandra, voice even but small. "He always knew how to stop and listen. That's why he's dangerous in the best way. He notices." Alexandra listened. It was a strange kind of counsel coming from someone who had spent her life in classrooms instead of boardrooms. The CEO, who had been trained to weigh reputational risk against shareholder expectation, found in Mrs. Hart a different metric: truth as fidelity to what a person had actually been. Alexandra felt the metric shift under her feet. The fact that a teacher who had no dog in the corporate fight wanted to speak up carried a different weight than any prepared statement. Words seeped outward. Mrs. Hart did nothing flashy. She wrote an email to a school alumni group and to a few parents she trusted. She called a local reporter she'd known for years, the type who still remembered city council meetings, not because they were cliques, but because they were about people. Her message was simple: "I have known Bernard since he was a boy. Let me tell you what I saw." Tyler, watching patterns in the cold light of his screen, did what his role taught him. He moved to shore up optics. He arranged a terse update for the press office and suggested a prophylactic release emphasizing cooperation with authorities. He urged Alexandra to let HR handle it. He pointed to statistics, impression metrics, the potential drop in investor confidence, the inevitability of lawsuits.
His language was measured, because he had learned that measured language could be a weapon. "Let them calm down," he told one of the PR chiefs. "Appearances matter. We issue the statement, we extend sympathy, and we contain the message before it metastasizes." Alexandra heard the sentence, and in a way heard the room she had grown up in. But the footage would not leave her. There are moments that bypass corporate syllogisms. A human face under compulsion presses itself past strategy. She had watched Bernard's hands move with purpose. That image did something to the place inside her that had once made her choose certain risks when she was younger and less careful. "I'm not letting this go," she said quietly to Tyler later, in the glass corridor where the corporate heart seemed to beat in tempered light. "Not as a press problem, as a person." Tyler registered the word person like it cut into his ledger. For him, the calculus included liability. For Alexandra, the calculus included responsibility. That difference would sooner or later define the line between them. The first public movement was small but decisive. Alexandra recorded and released a short, unadorned statement. She had reviewed the raw footage, she had seen more than a cropped still, and she thanked the man who had saved her. She said she would ensure he received care and would cooperate to clear up any misunderstanding. There was no grand apology for the company, no theatrical contrition. There was simply the admission of what she had seen and the pledge to act. The reaction was bifurcated. Some feeds cheered, glad for a narrative that allowed them to close their tabs with comfortable satisfaction. Others sniffed suspicion. "What does she gain?" read one comment. "Is this staged?" read another. The internet had learned its reflex: doubt before charity, suspicion before empathy. But the teacher's emails and a local reporter's small profile piece began to put texture back into the story. The public that had been willing to accept a single frame as truth began, reluctantly, to let context creep back in. Alexandra did not stop at a statement. She knew that words could be inexpensive and that what mattered was structural change. She found Bernard in the quiet hours after his observation, sitting up with a cup of tea a nurse had recommended.
his socked feet tucked under him like a child guarding warmth. He was no less composed than before, but there was a fatigue in his face and a wary caution in his eyes that said he'd been thrust into a foreign tide. He did not expect a private conversation with the CEO who had been the victim of his intervention. He did not expect the simplicity of her request. Come to the office, talk about what happened, let us make sure you are safe. He did not expect the way she would say, without ceremony, that she wanted to listen. They spoke for a long time in a meeting room that had been drained of performance.
Alexandra asked questions that were not PR-minded. She wanted to know why he had been there, how he had learned CPR, who Molly was, what the nights looked like when he came home. Bernard answered with an economy of words that worked like a light. He explained in small practical phrases that he had chosen this life to be present for Molly, that he wanted her to know a father who could make pancakes and attend science fairs, not an absentee who could buy them but not time them. He said plainly that he kept his papers folded in a book because a simple life protected his child from the complications of wealth, and because he had been tired of watching money erode honesty in people he had once loved. Alexandra listened. She noted the certificate she had seen in the hospital visit. Bernard did not elaborate until Alexandra asked, not for spectacle but for clarity. He told her quietly that he had once been part of a family company. He had taken an exit when the culture turned vicious, selling his shares and setting up an arrangement so that he could live well enough but not be accountable to the kind of competition that eats integrity for breakfast. He had set aside funds in ways he thought prudent, trusts for Molly's education, a small foundation to help scholarship students, and, most importantly to him, a principle that buying his way out of human contact would be worse than staying close. You could have walked away, Alexandra said, the observation not astonishment but fact. You could have disappeared into a hedge fund in the Caymans or somewhere cushioned. Bernard gave a small dry smile. I would have been safe, he said, but then who would I be doing regular things for? Being tolerated is not the same as being loved. I wanted to know what it felt like to be needed in ways money can't buy. There was something about the plainness of that answer that made Alexandra uneasy, and in a way she did not expect, respectful. She had lived a life watered by strategic choices. She had rarely let herself act without considering optics. Bernard had done the opposite. He had decided to assume the risk of being unseen. Alexandra's offer came without pomp. She would ensure he received full medical care and housing if needed. She would place a notarized public statement on behalf of the company clarifying what the footage actually showed and clearing him of any misconduct allegations. She would not hide the fact that the company had acted late in recognizing the full picture, but she would use the company's reach to correct the record. More than that, she invited her to help her design an employee welfare initiative, not as a token face on a brochure, but with actual authority to shape policies and hiring practices. It was a proposition that came with landmines. Bernard had reasons to distrust every seat of power he had ever seen. Pride, fear of spectacle, and the memory of being dragged out of a boardroom all clenched tight. He thought of his small apartment, of Molly's sleep, of the sticker collage on the fridge. He thought about Mrs. Hart's expression when she had seen the certificate, and the way it had made her reassess what she had always known about him. I don't want to be used, Bernard said. The sentence was a kind of litmus test. He wanted control over his vulnerability. Nor do I, Alexandra answered. If I do this, it will be messy. It will be messy because it will involve changing systems that have been in place for decades. It will require work that I cannot promise will be painless or immediate. But I will give you two things I can. A position on a committee that reports directly to the board, and my public support to ensure your safety while we do it. She stipulated no media flair. The institution would learn to move slowly, or not at all. She wanted to make sure it moved with intention. Bernard agreed to consider it. He told her he wanted to talk to his daughter, to Mrs. Hart, to the neighbor who had once lent him sugar. He wanted the choice to be collective. The company's internal response was predictably uneven. Tyler watched Alexandra's moves with professional alarm. He prepared countermeasures, ran background checks, compiled lists of potential vulnerabilities, and quietly spoke with a few board members about the dangers of impulsive magnanimity. He argued that the company should avoid entanglement with an employee's private finances, that a sanitized public statement was safer than the frankness Alexandra proposed. We cannot create a precedent, he said in a meeting where the word precedent was thrown like a net over conscience. But public pressure, once shifted, can be stubborn. Mrs. Hart had done something more consequential than emailing a friend. She had spoken on a local radio station, and her voice moved through the community in a way raw feeds could not. She told the story of a boy who had been given crayons and a chance, and who had used both to become a man who would step into danger for another without asking for applause. It was not a viral hit measured in millions of views. It was a string of human connections, a teacher's testimony carried by parents who remembered her kindness. That testimony pushed others who had been cautious to reconsider what the company's duty might be.
Still, Tyler would not give up easily. He assembled a small task force, analysts who could find patterns, a PR group that could reframe anything, and a junior lawyer whose job was to look for any threat of liability. They trawled through public records and personnel files for anything that could be cast as suspicious. They found nothing incriminating. Tyler then used subtler tactics. He reached out to a couple of influencers, people who could push the narrative back into doubt. He suggested, in a whisper of a briefed call, that Bernard's presence in the building might have allowed him access to confidential materials.
The influencer, whose appetite for engagement outweighed his ethical compass, ran with it, planting speculative threads that suggested motive. The smear returned in a different form, wearing the clothes of curiosity rather than condemnation. "Why would a man with means be cleaning?" asked an online column. "Is there a hidden angle?" The insinuation worked precisely because it felt plausible to those inclined toward cynicism. It was, in Tyler's mind, a way to redirect the conversation from corporate missteps to the supposed manipulations of an outsider. Alexandra watched the slow drift of suspicion with a mixture of frustration and resolve. She refused to let a smear composed of hints and innuendo set the terms. She convened a press conference, not to spectacle, but to clarity. Mrs. Hart stood with her, small and steady, her voice carrying a teacher's cadence. She spoke of Bernard's character, about the small acts of integrity she had witnessed over decades. She placed the certificate on the lectern and told in plain language that secrecy about wealth did not negate the bravery of a life-saving act. Bernard did not at first speak. He had learned how to make himself small when the world asked for spectacle. But the teacher's testimony had given him a kind of clearance. She had, in front of cameras and colleagues, said what many cared to say privately. "He saved a life. We know him. He has always had courage. Let that be the measuring stick." If there was one moment that shifted the climate, it was that. People like public narratives that include witnesses they trust. Mrs. Hart was such a witness for a neighborhood, and her story bled into local news cycles in a way that undermined Typer's tentative campaigns. Her testimony refused the simple cynicism that the smear wanted to cultivate. Tyler, sensing the tide turning, doubled down. He leaked a selective security still to an anonymous account, an image framed to suggest an angle that could be read as opportunistic. He couched it in a concerned citizen narrative, the kind that allowed him plausible deniability. The leak infected noon-hour talk shows, and for a day or two, heat returned. Smartphone comments reasserted their taste for scandal. Alexandra moved quickly to undo the damage. She released the raw security footage publicly, along with the timeline compiled by her own security team and verified by independent auditors. She asked the company's legal counsel to release a notarized statement confirming that Bernard had not breached any private materials and that surveillance had shown no evidence of malfeasance. The notarized statement had no theatrical flourish. It was a legal document that said simply and formally that the company had reviewed the matter and found Bernard's actions to be within the bounds of emergency response and human decency. The effect was not instantaneous. Social feeds have long memories for outrage, short for nuance. But the combination of
Hart's public testimony, Alexandra's transparent release of materials, and the notarized statement peeled away the velocity of the smear. A pattern formed. Personal truth, verified evidence, and a community witness can arrest a narrative bred by cynicism. Bernard's life, however, would not simply right itself. The humiliation had cost him nights of work and placed him under the watchful stares of neighbors and strangers. A small fund was set up, partly by Alexandra's contribution, partly by donations from colleagues who were shamed into generosity, to cover immediate needs, health bills, missed rent, and, crucially, secure housing while they worked on a longer-term solution. Bernard, to those who knew him, had never wanted to be a charity case. He wanted agency. That was why Alexandra's second offer mattered. Not a symbolic title, but a board-level committee seat with authority to propose policy. The initiative would be called, after a modest community vote, the Corridor Care Program. It would create a pipeline for raising hourly wages, fund emergency leave for night staff who are injured on the job, institute paid mental health counseling, and create a training and promotion track to move workers from entry roles into supervisory or technical positions. It would also establish an ombudsperson position, with the power to investigate reports of mistreatment without channeling everything through corporate HR alone. Bernard listened and then outlined the changes he thought essential. He insisted on metrics that could be measured: the percentage of janitorial staff promoted within 3 years, the number of emergency leave requests approved, the creation of a direct hotline to the board for complaints that might otherwise be ignored. He wanted a governance structure that included workers' representatives, not just executives. Alexandra agreed to all of it, and more importantly, pledged to bring it to the board as a package with implementation timelines and independent oversight. It felt, in its concept, like change. It felt to Bernard like a risk. He would be stepping into systems that had never been accountable in the way he proposed. There would be resistance from middle managers who saw the initiative as red tape or threat to their autonomy. There would be critics who would call it PR. There would be people like Tyler who would nurse a campaign to discredit him. Bernard knew the risks and felt them like low-level electrical buzz under his skin, but he also knew what the absence of such systems had cost people like his neighbors. He had seen, on late nights, the small tears of parents who could not make rent. He had watched coworkers accept substandard treatment because the alternative was their only paycheck. He accepted Alexandra's offer, but not easily.
He asked for one condition. The program would be co-led by someone from the workforce and someone from the executive team. Both would have veto power on implementation until independent auditors could certify fairness. He wanted the power to hire trusted people from the night shift into the administrative roles because he believed that lived experience mattered. Alexandra granted the condition and signed the papers. They both understood, privately and without ceremony, that the program could fail spectacularly. Tyler complained. He alleged that the initiative would create chaos, that it would be a drain on margins. He organized a small coalition of skeptical executives who questioned whether a program designed by one man's experience could scale sensibly within corporate constraints. But the board, pricked by the company's dented reputation and moved by Mrs. Hart's testimony, voted to greenlight a limited pilot. The pilot would begin in the building where Bernard had worked, expanding over time with audited results. Implementation was nowhere near glamorous. Bernard spent more time in cubicles than he had ever imagined, filling out forms and learning how to craft policy language that could survive legal scrutiny. He met with a cafeteria of service workers, sat in laundry rooms where the whir of machines was a rhythm he had known for years, and listened. He learned how to translate the pain he had witnessed into requests that would stand up to boards of numbers. He learned that change requires patient persistence and the ability to keep returning to arguments even when people are tired of hearing them. There were small victories. A supervisor who had been abusive was moved into a role with more oversight. A junior manager was given coaching rather than a promotion after complaints surfaced about microaggressions. A pilot program for paid emergency leave approved 3 requests in the first month and prevented 2 families from being evicted. The metrics were messy, promising enough to sustain hope but jagged enough to disabuse anyone of fantasies of quick fixes. The smear machine, however, never went silent. Tyler attempted a more surgical strike. He commissioned a freelance investigative piece that suggested Bernard's financial arrangements were personal and opaque. The piece insinuated that Bernard could exploit his role to funnel funds to himself. It was the kind of innuendo that wanted to press the reset button on public trust. Tyler's operatives whispered to journalists that there were conflicts that needed looking into. This time, the difference was transparency. Alexandra insisted that any review of Bernard's finances be conducted by an independent third-party auditor, one with no ties to the company. Bernard, who had once guarded his privacy like a talisman, consented to a limited disclosure, precisely because he wanted to remove the possibility of speculation being used as a weapon.
The auditors found what Bernard had always said. He had chosen modest living, kept funds in trust for Molly's future, and made a few anonymous donations to scholarship funds in neighborhoods he cared about. There was nothing nefarious. The report was dry and precise and detached, the very thing Tyler feared. When the report was released, the public response was a complicated thing. Some readers shrugged and moved on. Others paused long enough to notice that a woman from a neighborhood school had been right for years. Mrs. Hart's role remained catalytic. She had, in public forums and community events, said something simple. When you see someone act for others without a camera, believe the act before you believe the frame. Molly watched these developments from a distance, a small person who cared about her father's dignity more than the arc of any campaign. She listened to adult talk in the kitchen and learned a new vocabulary of resilience. She began to understand that lives can be complicated in ways that do not diminish love or courage. She still liked pancakes and the way her father made voices for dinosaur toys. She began to call Bernard's office on certain afternoons, asking harmless, tender questions about snacks and schedules. In those calls, Bernard found an anchor. Janet Holloway, a neighbor who had been a kind presence with a tray of cinnamon buns that first week after the firing, became unexpectedly involved in the program's early outreach. She had run a small childcare cooperative and knew from the ground which crisis supports actually helped families. She advised Bernard on how to make emergency funds accessible without onerous paperwork, and she taught the team how to keep dignity during intake processes. Bernard, who had never thought of himself as an administrator, found himself learning small governance skills from women who had practiced them for years in the community. Months passed. The pilot in the building became a case study. Lower turnover, increased employee satisfaction on anonymous surveys, fewer complaints about managers who had once been insulated by corporate distance.
It was not perfect. There were errors, missteps that required apology, and a few misjudgments that cost people dearly and had to be corrected. The program's most important metric, whether people felt safer and more respected, was harder to quantify, but nonetheless showed tentative progress. Publicly, Bernard was a more complicated figure than the internet's appetite for simple drama allowed. To some, he remained an object of fascination, the janitor who secretly had money. To others, he was a living rebuke to facial assumptions about poverty and dignity. In corners of social conversation, people argued, does wealth make an act less heroic? Many concluded that it didn't, that the heroism lay in the choice to endure anonymity and choose service anyway.
The narrative that Bernard's life had offered the city, the messy, stubborn story of a man who had refused to hide his person behind his bank account, became for some a mirror. The teacher's central role continued to be felt. Mrs. Hart became, without seeking power, a moral anchor people turned to when the conversation threatened to slick into cynicism. She hosted community forums where workers could speak to executives in small rooms without cameras. She insisted that the language of the program be clear and accessible, not corporate gloss. In one memorable session, she rose and said, in her plain, commanding way, "If this program asks for more from the people it serves than it asks from the people who run it, then it is not worthy of our trust." Her words landed as practical wisdom and filmable truth. They gave Bernard something he had not known he needed, a moral referee who could speak for the quiet dignity of everyday work. Tyler, watching metrics again, finally acknowledged defeat in the boardroom. He argued, reluctantly, that his measures had been attempts at damage control. He was not heartless, he said, but practical. The board, whose members had seen a small but accelerating improvement in public perception and employee surveys, asked for a middle ground. Tyler was shifted to a different role with less direct influence over PR, not as a punishment, but as a management recalibration. He left with his pride intact enough to tell the story later in a pleasant podcast about crisis management and how sometimes you must lose a battle to see a better strategy. In private, he blamed misread numbers and latent human failings. One evening, months into the program, the company held a modest internal launch event for Corridor Care's first anniversary. It was not an extravagant celebration. It was a gathering in a converted conference room where the folding chairs looked less like theater and more like a town hall. Workers from maintenance and security sat alongside mid-level managers. Janitors in uniforms rubbed shoulders with HR representatives who had spent late nights drafting policy. Bernard was asked to speak. He had, over time, become less fearful of public moments. He had learned to channel his unease into direct speech. He began with a small joke about how he'd been a terrible student in algebra and yet somehow had to talk about metrics he didn't trust. Laughter loosened the room. He did not speak for long. His speech was short because he preferred actions to paragraphs. "What matters," he said, "is that when someone falls, literally or metaphorically, there's a hand that doesn't judge what's in their pockets before it offers help. That's what this program tries to make normal." He paused and looked out at faces he had known for years. "I didn't take this position to be a hero. I took it because I could see a path to protect people I care about."
If this program helps one night shift worker not lose a place to sleep, if it helps a parent know that an injury won't also cost them their job, then we've begun to do what matters. Mrs. Hart sat in the front row, quiet and proud. Molly, who had been shy about attending at first, was there too, perched on a lap like anyone else's child, and when Bernard finished, she caught his hand and squeezed it. The room filled with small applause. That was not theatrical, but real. After the event, a reporter asked Bernard how he reconciled the secret of his wealth with the work he now did. He did not skirt the question. "I chose this life," he said. "Wealth can be a tool or a shield. I used it to make sure my daughter could sleep and to keep a promise to some people who needed scholarships. But it did not buy me presents, and it won't buy the dignity people deserve. That's why this program matters. It makes systems accountable, not philanthropic theatrics." The reporter framed the line for the evening news as the moral heart of the story. It made people on two sides of the question nod uneasily. It did not resolve every argument. It simply made the claim that money alone is not the proxy for moral action. Months turned into a year, and the Corridor Care program expanded into 3 other buildings. It hired an ombudsperson with real clout and instituted a transparent complaints portal that prevented anonymous piling on while protecting whistleblowers. The pilot's early data showed tangible benefits. Turnover dropped by a measurable percentage in participating sites, emergency leave claims decreased the number of last-minute no-shows, and employee morale improved within the pilot cohort. None of this was miraculous.
It was the result of steady work, and when setbacks occurred, the team, by then including people who had once been janitors themselves, returned to the community for fixes. Bernard's life gained an odd new texture. He was still a father who made pancakes. He still kept his apartment modest because he preferred it that way. He used some of his personal funds to seed a community education program that taught basic financial literacy and vocational skills. But he also insisted that the structural changes remained the focus. No one's dignity should be for sale, and no reform should rest on a single person's wealth. There were intimate reaches of his life that media never followed. He and Molly had quiet evenings where they read by a lamp, where the conversation center was a new school project or a joke about a missing sock. Janet would sometimes bring over a casserole they would share. Mrs. Hart continued to visit, never for publicity and always for the human exchange of listening. These small domestic scenes remained the fulcrum of Bernard's life, the reason his public tasks had an ethical gravity he refused to squander. The teacher's reaction, the moment she pulled the certificate out of Bernard's pocket, had continued to reverberate.
At a community forum months later, she stood and addressed a crowd that included neighborhood parents, company executives, and a live streaming audience. "When I saw that piece of paper," she said, "I felt an ache. But that ache turned into a clearer sense of responsibility. If people who have resources hide behind modesty to avoid accountability, that's one problem. If people who have resources use their identity to silence others, that's another." Bernard chose something else. He chose to be seen for what he does, and he asked for responsibility in return. Her words were not a vindication that erased nuance. They were a parsing of it. The crowd listened, and a significant number of people spoke afterward about the need for more teachers, more neighbors, more people willing to bear witness. In a world of trending outrages, the teacher's considered voice became a model for how communities could respond without bloodlust, marshaling attention into careful action. It did not mean everything was settled. Lawsuits never fully closed. There were still calls for action from angles that had nothing to do with Bernard personally and everything to do with the company's broader practices. The news cycle turned to other dramas. New scandals flared elsewhere. But the company's corridor care program, having survived its first year, served as a case study other institutions began to watch. Some copied elements of it. Some pretended to copy and did nothing meaningful. The difference was visible in the data. Bernard sometimes wondered if his decision to reveal part of his life had changed the texture of people's gratitude. He worried that some would now see his previous acts as stage-managed, that suspicion would creep back into kindness. The teacher had warned him that disclosures reshape relationships in ways that are rarely tidy. People will need time, she had said, to reorder their expectations. Give them that time, but insist on accountability. There were tender moments that felt like quiet victories. One night, on his way home from a meeting about unionizing support for service workers, Bernard saw a former colleague he'd worked with on a night shift pass by. The colleague nodded, a small, grateful lift of the chin, and Bernard could tell, in the bow of that gesture, that the work they had done to change conditions mattered more than any headline. He felt a humility that was not humiliation, but an honest measure of effort. Tyler, in a later interview with a business magazine, conceded that the initial reflex to cull risk had failed to account for human reality. He spoke about the lessons of the episode, that crisis management without ethical consideration can create worse outcomes than the crisis itself. His words were not a full mea culpa, but they were a sign that institutional culture had been nudged. In quiet conversations, some executives acknowledged that the episode had forced them to see employees differently. Alexandra, for her part, did not spin the moment into personal glory. She continued to lead with a mixture of tactical care and the vulnerability of someone who had been forced to confront imperfect choices. She insisted on the program's independence and the board's obligation to fund it properly. She occasionally dined with Bernard and listened as he described practical, sometimes mundane adjustments that would improve workers' lives: locker room repairs, break schedules, equitable distribution of overtime. It was these small details, rather than the grand gestures, that would change people's day-to-day realities. Years later, the memory of the boardroom collapse still lived in the company's institutional memory as a case that had revealed both the fragility of reputation and the possibility for meaningful reform. Corridor care had not solved systemic inequality. It had not turned the tide of corporate culture nationwide. It had, however, demonstrated that a program rooted in worker input, endorsed by community witnesses like Mrs. Hart, and backed by executive accountability, could yield concrete benefits. Bernard and Molly moved to an apartment a little closer to the school where Mrs. Hart still taught.
It was a modest place, not ostentatious, chosen for proximity to friends and for the community it offered. Bernard sometimes used his funds to support after-school programs and scholarships, but he never flaunted the source. He had learned that wealth could complicate humility, and he guarded the way he used it with a practical, almost legalistic caution. On a warm evening, months after the program's third expansion, Bernard and Molly stood on the small balcony of their new apartment. The city spread below them, not as a map of institutions, but as a collection of lives. Lights blinked like human, stubborn constellations. He held Molly's hand and listened as she talked about a science project with the earnestness of a child who believes the world is still mostly good. He felt a satisfaction that was not triumph, but a softer sense of work tending toward fruit. "You did something that mattered," Mrs. Hart said once, later, when they met for tea. "Not as a performance, but as a friend who had kept a vigil. Not because you had money, because you chose to be accountable when you could have hidden. That's the surprise we all needed." Bernard looked at the teacher who had once taught him punctuation and said simply, "I didn't want to be invisible." She smiled. "Now you aren't," she said, "but remember, visibility should come with responsibility." He nodded and carried the words like a compass. The final chapter, if anything in life is ever final, was not a tidy wrap, but a steadying of the world enough for some people to breathe again. The Corridor Care Program continued to adapt.
New initiatives sprouted, a fund for emergency childcare, an apprenticeship for night workers to gain credentials in building maintenance, a mental health hotline staffed by counselors who had been trained to understand blue-collar pressures. None of it was perfect. Bureaucracy crept in. There were meetings that became endless. There were people who took longer to believe. But across the sites where the program took hold, lives were measurably steadier. As for the teacher whose reaction had shocked the world into rethinking its frames, she kept teaching. She showed up at PTA meetings and at community forums, and she would sometimes, in the evenings, drop by Bernard's apartment with a tray of cookies and ask for updates on how the program was doing. She had no interest in policymakers' language. Her currency was plain truth. One morning, as the program's second-year report arrived, Bernard sat with a printout and scanned the numbers. Turnover had dropped. Emergency leave utilization had been formalized. Promotions had risen. The ombudsperson's office had received fewer complaints about retaliation because people trusted the process. The words on the page were not the type that feed headlines, but they were the type that quiet lives measure, in utility bills paid, in children kept from eviction, in supervisors learning to listen. He stuck the report onto the fridge beside Molly's collage, and as a private ritual added a new sticker to the calendar for a night out with her. He had learned that life's meaning came in small calibrations, a contest won, a dinner with a neighbor, a policy that protected a worker. The city continued to move in fast currents. New scandals would come along and quickly eclipse old ones. Yet in a modest office where janitors and executives now met, a new language had taken root: accountability, dignity, and the pragmatic mechanisms by which systems could be adjusted. It was not utopia. It was, however, the beginning of something that had once seemed impossible. A place where a life-saving act did not have to be weaponized into spectacle, where seeing a person could lead to structural change rather than merely a headline. That balance between visibility and responsibility, between private choice and public duty, remained delicate. Bernard knew it would always be so. He also knew that the teacher's reaction had changed more than the narrative arc of his life. It had changed the moral grammar of his neighborhood. Where once a single frame could decide a person's fate, now there were witnesses and audits, and slow policies designed to make space for truth. On the balcony that night, with Molly chattering about constellations she could barely pronounce, Bernard felt an odd gratitude, not because the world had been fair, but because a series of choices, by a teacher who refused to be silent, by a CEO who chose evidence over optics, by a community that listened, had turned crisis into possibility.
He thought of the hands that had saved a life and the hands that now shaped the policies that would protect others. He tightened his grip on Molly's small fingers and watched the city lights blink back. The story would be told many ways over the years, as scandal, as redemption, as a cautionary tale about assumption. But for now, standing in the quiet between work and sleep, Bernard let the sound of his daughter's voice steady him. Share this if someone in your life deserves to be seen.